So I'm going to be talking about the transition that's happening in worldview right now, especially in the United States. Probably if more people actually knew the guts of the talk that we're going to be talking about tonight, they would be here, because these are the very battles that they're facing on their dinner tables, with their kids, with their grandkids, with their coworkers, with their colleges, with their universities, with all of it. And so we're going to really dive into some of those questions and conversations in a deep way, and hopefully it'll be helpful to you. But in Psalm 62, I'm just going to read, "For God alone my soul awaits in silence. From him comes my salvation. He alone is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be greatly shaken." Verse 3, "How long will all of you attack a man to batter him, like a leaning wall, a tottering fence? They only plan to thrust him down from his high position. They take pleasure in falsehood. They bless with their mouths, but inwardly they curse." One of the things I'm going to be talking about is the fact that as we're facing the worldview shift that we're facing in our country, the worldview dominance shift that we're facing in our nation right now, we are likely going to be on the receiving end of more and more and more being closed off. We might even call it persecution as the Christian church. Now, we'll fix it here last, probably, of everywhere in the country in East Texas. Places like Nacogdoches and Tyler, which are kind of the diamond on the cowboy, on the buckle of the Bible Belt. And that's really, we're protected for the longest period of time, but eventually we'll start experiencing it here too. And when that happens, we remember this, that when we are attacked and battered, verse 5 picks up, "For God alone, O my soul, wait in silence. My hope is from him. He only is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be shaken." When Bobby asked me to come and be a part of this, I immediately think about, when you think about that, you've probably heard of the men of Issachar referenced in 1 Chronicles. You get a list of people in 1 Chronicles, a list of the different tribes and what's going on with them. And the men of Issachar, it says, "who had understanding of the times, to know what Israel ought to do." That's key terminology. Some of you may have, you've been in church long enough, you may have heard a pastor reference the idea that they'll say, listen, when you ask a Secret Service agent and they're trying to figure out counterfeit bills, that they study the real bills, not the counterfeit bills, because if you know the real bills really well, then you can spot the counterfeits. You may have heard that taught somewhere. Well, I taught that somewhere about 25 years ago with a group of people, and afterwards had a couple come up to me and say, "Hey, you know what? We love how well that preaches, but we were both Secret Service agents, and we were in the counterfeit division, and that's not true. We study the fake ones, we study the right ones, we study all of them." And I was like, I was always suspicious. I thought that preached it a little too well. Anytime something preaches that well, it's something dubious about it. But so they challenged with that. And we want to be looking at, so I'm going to spend the first part of this time, and certainly you're going to want to stop me and ask questions if you want to. Now, there's a small enough group that you might can feel okay doing that. If you want to stop me and ask a question, go ahead and do that at any point that you want to. But I know that that's hard because you're in a sanctuary, and you've been trained all your life not to do anything disruptive in here. For now, it's totally fine. Like I don't what the pastor would say next week, but today it's okay to begin looking at and asking questions if you've got any questions as we go through it. So, how do different people explain the same event? That's where we get the idea of a world view. So you can look at the theist explanation or the atheist explanation of things, even in the Bible. You may not know this, but like there is an atheist explanation, for example, of the Exodus, the Exodus out of Egypt. The theist explanation is that there's a battle between Almighty God and the gods of Egypt. That's what's going on. Is probably the best explanation. But I have heard the secular explanation of the very same events, which you go, well, if there's ever anything that's been crazy miraculous, it's going to be the plagues of Egypt, right? I mean, blood and frogs and all that. And yet you go through the whole list that there was a red tide algae bloom, that frogs were chased from the water, and so were gnats and lice, which spread disease to the livestock, which caused diseases to go and boils, and then there was a volcano, allegedly at that time, and all this kind of stuff. So would you go, okay, that makes better sense to me? Well, a lot of that's going to depend on what your worldview is when you come in, what kind of glasses you have on. When we do worldview training at the church, sometimes we'll actually hand out different color lensed glasses and then throw different things up on the screen. And depending on your lens of glasses, you can't see certain things that are on the screen. And that's kind of what a worldview is like. It's the way you see. It's the glasses that you wear when you look out into the world. It's kind of a cheesy Christian term that's often overused or used badly, but it's still a good way for understanding what's going on. A conversion is a destruction of a worldview. That when you have a conversion, when you convert from one thing to another, what you're doing is you're taking off a pair of glasses and putting on a different pair of glasses, and that can be incredibly painful. It can be you can be ridden with guilt over that kind of thing. It's very difficult to do, and so it's challenging when we're encouraging people to take these stances. Years ago, having a client, I'm a therapist. I'm going to introduce myself in just a second, by the way, but as a therapist, having a client who in counseling changed her view essentially within an hour because of what she was wrestling through in her own heart on abortion. And so she had an abortion, or actually had a couple abortions as a teenager, and she had never told anybody. And once that came out, and she started the process of wrestling through what that meant for her, that she had always been this very strong pro-abortion advocate. And then after just talking about it the very first time, the next time she came in to see me, she was actually filled with anger at the way the world had taught her wrongly about abortion, as she had done actual research on it for the first time in her life. And she was horrified by it. Well, that's a worldview change. She switched out her glasses. She had never bothered to do any research on that before because she didn't want to and didn't need to. And so that began to change for her. Maybe one of the things for us, especially those of us who are parents, as we start seeing the type of statistics for the up-and-coming generations as to what's going on with them, this is why Bobby wants this something that this church is engaging in this conversation. Every pastor anywhere is hoping that their church will engage in some of this because we are potentially looking at a radical change, a conversion of our students over the next 10 or 15 years. When my young church staff, when they want to meet with me and discuss these types of questions, I tell them, my fear now is less about whether or not they're going to be able to get their, quote, Christian friends to return to church in the next 10 years, but whether they, as church staff leaders, will have walked away from the church in the next 10 years. Because the pressure is coming, and the pressure is high. And as the worldview balance, as the balance of power shifts, it's not going to be okay to have a Christian worldview. You can be a Christian, but it won't be okay to have a Christian worldview. We'll get there. Notice this statistic is that you're talking about people, to what extent do you agree or disagree with the following statement? So that part of my faith means being a witness about Jesus. 65% of these, this is for young people only, okay? This is Millennial Practicing Christians was the title here. Millennial Practicing Christians. How many of them, so practicing Christians from the millennial population, 65% said that's an important part of their witness, and yet it is wrong to share one's personal beliefs. 28% agree strongly, and 19% agree that it is not that you should, but that you shouldn't, that it is immoral to share your religious beliefs with people who have different religious views. That's the stance of the up-and-coming generation of kids who claim to be Christian. And so they're missing some very key Christian worldview mindsets. Who am I to tell somebody else they're wrong? I should be allowed to believe whatever I want about myself. We're going to get there is the idea. And so it's deeply offensive to tell somebody else about themselves. Who am I hurting? So if I believe anything that I want to about myself, we'll get there. So real quickly, who I am. Now, ironically, I would say if I was doing a TED Talk at this point, I would say my name is Chris Legg, and I've been married this many years. I've been married since 1993. I've got 5 great kids. I've got parents willing to come to a talk for 4 hours with me, and then on top of that, I'm a lead pastor. I'm a licensed counselor, and then what would I say? I know? Welcome to my TED Talk. Before I do that, what do I say? My personal pronouns are he, him, it, they, whatever it happens to be, right? Why do I have to do that? Well, it's because I'm telling you something about me that you don't get to say to me about me. Only I get to decide these things. This sounds like not a big deal. It's a big deal. So the truth of the matter is that and these are all things you can look back up later. But the whole PowerPoint may even be somewhere online where you can find it. That's fine. So as the lead pastor of, let's see if it goes. There you go. Of South Spring, it's so cool. If we got this, we might as well show it, right? Of South Spring Baptist Church there in Tyler, and then which is a really fun church, a lot of freedom there. And then I also am the owner and operator of Lathia Family Counseling Center, which up there in Tyler. Okay, so that's enough about me. Let's jump into where does this come from. Now I'm going to go back way back with this. So we're going to start with what's called metaphysics. And this will help you understand how we got where we are and why the underlying view is so different. Okay? So, the underlying view. How did we get here? Let's start with this. We're going to start with philosophy. And the first philosophy, the first metaphysic, is the pre-modern metaphysic. So, I know this sounds deep, but it won't be. You're going to like this. So, here's the deal. The pre-modern, the way of a metaphysic is the way of engaging with reality. What does it mean to be real? What does it mean to be a human in the universe? So there's a lot. You can spend your whole life studying any one of these. We're going to focus in on one trait that goes across these. The first one is this. In the pre-modern view, there's an external source for everything. Okay, I'll say that again. There's an external source for everything. Outside of you and me, there's a source for that. There's a source for what is true. There's a source for what is right. There's even a source for what is beautiful, and there's a source for what is good. In the pre-modern view, you didn't decide whether something was beautiful. There was a force outside of you that did that. God or fate or the gods or something else would decide even that. There was music that was good music and music that was bad music. And the gods determined what that was. Not you. And then, somewhere along around the year 1215, the signing of the Magna Carta started a process, somewhere around in there started a process towards what we now call modernism. Okay, so modernism, under pre-modernism, there were all kinds of things that God had determined. So when you have something like Genesis 1:26, God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish in the seas and the birds in the heavens, etc." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female. He created them. Well, there you go. That decision's done. Like, that argument's over. God did it. This is how God did it. God dictated the terms. He invented the words. It was all went with it, everything along the way. His image, his design, his understanding, his creation, and his evaluation of his creation. It was very good. And you can even notice the emphasis on the male and femaleness of the human creation, of when God created it. Second only an emphasis to being created in his image, which we're going to come back to, because it is the fact that man was created in God's image is a huge part of the Christian worldview. Huge part. Like, it's hard to overestimate it. So man came from the earth and woman came from man, but this only matters if there is an external source who gets to speak into this. This only matters if there is a God. Okay, we can look at another one. We have the instruction after the whole flood incident, the whole flood thing. We have an instruction, what's called the Noahic covenant. Be fruitful. Blood is the measure of life. We get in this passage when God is speaking to Noah, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. Why? So here we go. We get God dictating the punishment for murder here in the Noahic covenant. If you really want to get freaked out, I've done this a couple of times, in front of a whole bunch of college students, ask them something that is morally wrong. What is morally wrong? And they always give the same answer. It is murder. They always say that. Murder. Murder's wrong. Then you want to get creeped out, just say, why? And what you realize is you're in a room full of students who have no fundamental reason for why they shouldn't kill you in cold blood. They've got nothing. They're like, I don't know. I don't know. It's just not supposed to do that kind of thing, right? What does the Christian worldview state? Why does God say in the Noahic covenant it's wrong to murder? In fact, it's so wrong to murder, we'll kill you if you do it. It's that big a preventative, right? Listen, you just need to know you only get to do this once. That's it, and then we're going to kill you. Why? What does God follow that up with? I know? Because man is created in the image of God. Look how fundamental that statement back from Genesis 2 is. It's the foundation for all of our laws, for all of our respect for one another. No more civilization-ending floods, but God is saying an application of the truth of being created in the image of God. I don't want to spend a lot of time here, but you have the story of Jesus in the New Testament when they ask him, should they pay taxes? And Jesus says, give me a coin. And when Jesus takes that coin, he says, whose image is on the coin? And they say, Caesar, right? And he says, then give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what is God's. Well, it's a good Jewish audience, as you probably are, especially if you came to Passover a couple years ago. And you're a good Jewish audience, then you know the minute you hear the word image, you should think of being created in the image of God. And so when Jesus says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, well, what is Caesar's? The coin. How do you know it's his? Because his face is on it. It bears his image. So give it to him. There's a whole lot more to this that I don't have time to unpack tonight, but there's a whole lot of detail with this that's really cool when you know the roots of it. That being said, okay, and give to God what is God's. Okay, well, what do you give to God then? Ourselves. Why? Because we're his. How do we know we're his? Because we bear his image. That's what Jesus is teaching here in this passage. We are his, therefore we give ourselves to him. In the same way we'd give our money to Caesar, we give ourselves to God because we bear his image. This image concept is so vital all through the New Testament. If we're not created in God's image, human beings just aren't that special, right? In fact, it's very important when we educate our children that we teach the deep theological truths. And this is a deep theological truth, by the way.
Remember, God made you special, and he loves you very much. Bye!
Okay, there you go. So if we wanted to dive into it, we would teach on teleology, providence, and the image of God, which is what those two vegetables just taught us about, right? That's the deal. This is very important to our teaching, and we're going to run into over and over again. Man was created in God's image so that we can invest in each other. Now, so here's what happened. After a while, somewhere around the Magna Carta, we started a new process, and this new process, this new way of thinking is called modernism. So remember what made pre-modernism special? Where was the source? External, outside of us, right? Okay, good. With modernism, so in pre-modernism, pre-modern thought, which is the entirety of the Bible was written in pre-modern thought, the entirety of the Jewish teaching, all of Greek philosophy, all of that is mostly pre-modern in its thought. There's an external source for these things. The Greek word that I named my counseling practice after, aletheia, aletheia. Letheia means known, means not. So, aletheia means hidden, said that wrong. Letheia means hidden, means not. Because they understood it's the Greek word for truth. Truth is external of us. Truth is something humans discover. It's not something we create. It's external of us. That's the Greek understanding. In modernism, you start getting this teaching. We're not just creations. We are creature creators. The universe is not just our home. It is the material with which we make our home. That's the idea of modernism. Now, there's a whole lot more to modernism. I'm focusing on this one thing. So that's why you get the type of stuff that you get. You get the scientific revolution. You get the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation comes in modern thinking. Well, I don't just follow what the Pope says. I also get to read Scripture for myself and understand what it says. There's an internal process as well as an external process. And that's what modernism begins to teach. There are external sources and there are internal sources, both. You follow? Pre-modern, external only. Modern, a mixture. Well, and as this mixture happens, as you get through the Renaissance, the Scientific Revolution, the Protestant Reformation, the Enlightenment era, is that you get this, external sources, internal sources, and slowly but surely, it's mostly external, and then it's very little internal, and it slowly shifts. And when you get to the middle, you get something called humanism. Humanism is fundamentally where humans are the main source. The main source of all things is us. Most things come from us. Almost all of us are at least partially modern in our thinking. Nothing wrong with that. But we would say, for example, most of us would agree with the statement, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. That's a modern statement. I decide what's beautiful. There's no external source for beauty. If you and I disagree, if we go, hey, what's the greatest band of the 1960s and 70s, we could debate about it, and unless you're something really extreme, probably no one's going to tell you you're wrong. They might go, I don't see that. I don't agree with you, but, whatever your tastes are. Because we've decided that aesthetics and things like music and art, those are internal sources, what is good for that. Then you get, after time, you get something called postmodernism. Postmodernism shows up in the late 1800s. And it's not something that you've probably heard it demonized a lot, which is understandable. Especially in the Christian world, because very little of the Christian worldview overlaps well with postmodern thought. But now when people reference postmodernism, this is what they're referencing. Postmodernism is a metaphysic. It's a fundamental way of engaging with reality. And one of those has to do with what we talked about. It's important that you recognize that most of us, it looks like everybody in the room probably was not only raised by someone who was largely with postmodern thought, but was educated under people with mostly postmodern thought. And many of us were raised by people who were educated under postmodern thought. And so it's part of our thinking now, whether we realize it or not. That's what a metaphysic is. That's part of it. So you get guys like Nietzsche, and you get people painting pictures that have nothing to do with reality. And you go, that's really weird. That's called postmodern art or postmodern architecture. You get Darwin and Freud and others who talk more and more about this is reality is an internal experience. Freud, who teaches us that the main thing about us is our own psychology. That's the main thing about us. Well, that's not at all a pre-modern way of thinking. The main thing about you for a pre-modern is what God says about you. In the modern thought, now in postmodern thought, the main thing is what does your own psychology say about you? There's a few good things that have come from postmodern thought in the church. One is things like having a Passover at the church. Because we now know from postmodern thought has shown us that understanding the context of something is vitally important. And so you understand the Lord's Supper in a way that you never have before after you experience a Passover. You go, the context of this makes sense. It's why churches all do Israel trips now. It's because we want to go experience the land where these things happen, to experience the context of it. There's a whole movement. It's a very exciting movement within theology and Bible study. It's the re-Jewification of Scripture, the re-Jewification of Jesus Christ himself. It's a seminar that I love to go and teach on to show people how when we understand the way the first century Jewish people thought. There are podcasts coming out about this more and more. Any of you seen the TV show The Chosen? Have you seen any of those? Okay, those are deeply rooted in the first century Jewish thought. That's part of why they're so good, is that they affect you. People watch that and you go, oh, well, now that makes sense why Jesus said that or did that or whatever, because you see the context that was really there. And we can be thankful for postmodern thought for teaching us there's a context for everything. One of the main things that postmodern thought has cost us, though, pre-modern thought says there's an external source for everything: truth, morality, purpose, reason, etc. Modern thought says there's some human, some external, some internal, some external, and depending on where you are. Postmodern thought says there is no external source. There is nothing outside of you to dictate any terms to you. Won't go into detail about it, but in this, just so you would, if you were to deal with it, you could deal with these different headings. Again, we could teach on this for forever. This is Dr. Craig and Dr. Moreland, who have written some great material on this, philosophers who have these basic thinkings of postmodern thought. But you'll notice a couple at the bottom there, the rejection of foundationalism, meaning, in other words, the search for truth, the search for certainty, or the change to nominalism. Words don't represent universals. They're just names. It makes it really hard to have conversations when people keep changing what a word means. It's really hard to have a debate when people keep changing what the word means. I don't know if you guys saw, but that during a recent congressional hearing, there was an issue in which during the hearing a person said something. Another congressperson said that it was offensive what they said. And during the hearing, dictionary.com changed the definition on dictionary.com to indicate that it was offensive. So it wasn't, if you started the hearing, this wasn't an offensive word. But by the end of the hearing, now it was an offensive word. It changed because an offensive person used the word, and therefore now the word must be offensive, and that's how quickly the definitions for things are changing for us. In postmodern thought, that makes total sense. Who gets to say what a word means, right? Some of you are thinking, this sounds like Alice in Wonderland. It is Alice in Wonderland. That's actually a big part of what Lewis Carroll was doing, was mocking in advance postmodern thought, especially through the Looking Glass. If you read through the Looking Glass, you'll spot a lot of him mocking a lot of the stuff. We may get to that at some point. So, I could, if we wanted to, there's no reason for us to do it here today, but one of the things we can do is we can have people place where does it go. If I say a science, if I say I'm going to reference a type of science and you tell me, is this a fact-based science or is this a theory-based or even opinion-based science? So if I say psychology, is that a fact-based science? Is it a hard science? Or do you say, no, that's an opinion-based science? What do you think? Psychology. Fact-based or opinion-based? What do you think? Okay, opinion. Most people are going to lead it down more towards the opinion end of things, right? So what if I say physics? Does physics belong down here or does physics belong over there? Where would you tend to put it? Right, you tend to go down here. And then you become a serious student of physics and you discover that the main theory of physics right now is called what? Relativity. Which is that reality is different depending on your point of view, on your relative perspective, and the speed at which you're traveling. And all of a sudden, quantum physics comes into it, and then you're really going to have your mind blown of how little we actually know and how theories are just being thrown out there left and right and thrown down. And it turns out that's a real normative thing. There's now actually people pushing multiverse physics, which is entirely theoretical. It sounds like science fiction because it is essentially science fiction, but it's being pushed as a theoretical option. Or even causation-based physics, which means the universe out there only exists because we think it does. And if we all agreed that it didn't exist, it would stop existing. That's actually a physics theory. That's not a psychology theory. All of the sciences are getting to mishmash together because of the identity issues that we're dealing with. So you're going to be facing this. These young people, when they go off to school, are going to face this in really some tough ways, probably. So let me explain why. Any questions at this point? I know I'm just going fast. If there's any questions at this point. Okay, good. Or rather bad. I don't know what that means. So let's talk about this for a second. Okay, so kind of shake off what we've been saying. Hold on to that the pre-modern, modern, and postmodern. There's no external source for anything. And then you'll recognize that the way we as Christians deal with a fundamental question like, how do we know things? That creates an issue. So the issue of how do we know something? What is truth? So the world thinks that truth happens like this. The modern worldview, the common worldview today in America, probably somewhat more than half the people, if you ask them where truth comes from, they're going to say it comes from them. It comes from their brain. Their brain causes truth. That is not the Christian worldview, as we talked about. Now, why would they say our brain, see if I can do it backwards. Why would they say our brain causes truth? Go back to your metaphysics. Why? Okay, and the postmodern worldview says what? There is no external source. Very good. So if there's no external source, the only cause must be us, right? So if there is something that's true, I kid you not, I have a counseling student who is seeing clients, and she said her professor said last week or 2 weeks ago in a class, he started by saying, listen, you counseling, so these are master's level counseling students, and the professor says, hey, you just need to know when you go into a counseling session, you need to check your values at the door. That's what she came in and told me. The professor told her to check your values at the door. And I said, like that one? And that's a value statement. Checking your values at the door is a statement of value. This is important that you check those values at the door. And I was like, I'll bet he doesn't mean that. I'll bet there's some values he doesn't want you to check at the door. I'll bet you could throw a bunch of them out and go like, should I check this one at the door? Should I check this one at the door? How about my ethics? Should I have ethics in my counseling? Yes. That would be a value. You want me to do that one? Should I listen to your teaching? Like, should I listen to what you're teaching me in order to learn how to be a better counselor? Yes. So I should value your teaching when I'm going into counseling. And so a student pushed back just a tiny bit, and the professor said, your guys are all under the false impression that there's such a thing as truth. There's no such thing as truth. Now, I'll tell you, as a preacher and a teacher now for a long time, I didn't know anyone still said that. I know there are people who believe that. I just didn't know there were people still ignorant enough to say there's no such thing as truth. So you can imagine, what's the problem with saying there's no such thing as truth? Yeah, you're claiming a truth when you say that. It's a self-contradictory statement. You're not allowed to say things that, if it's true, are then false. If I say, no sentence has 5 words, so you should take a second. So what's the problem with the statement, no sentence has 5 words? If it's true, well, then it's false. That doesn't work. You shouldn't hold any beliefs that, if true, are therefore false. Check your values at the door. You should check your values at the door as an example of that. There's no such thing, there's no evidence, there's no knowledge except for empirical evidence, scientific evidence. What's the problem with that? You can't prove that with scientific evidence. You can't prove with scientific evidence that scientific evidence is the only source of knowledge. Now, I'm a big fan of science, but to claim it's the only source of knowledge is nonsensical because you can't test it in a lab. You can only test it reasonably, which means there's a second source of knowledge. Those are the ideas that create the problem here. So we go, no, the truth is not something we invent. That's silliness. The truth is something that we discover. This is important part of the Christian worldview. Here's what's so hard. It's so hard for people to engage. When you're engaging in these conversations, it's so hard because when you say, no, this is what the truth is, they're going to blame you. They're going to blame you for what you're claiming to be the truth. I had a really long conversation with an atheist on his podcast, and at the end he asked me my views on homosexuality. And I said, well, do you want my views or do you want God's scriptural views? Because my views are irrelevant. They don't make any difference what I think or feel about it. What matters is what God proclaims about it, and I submit myself to those views. I don't have to like them. I don't even have to understand them. Knowledge is not something I'm creating. And he said, well, you should just change those views then. Why don't you just change those views? It's like I don't get to change truth by thinking differently. That's not how reality works. But he thinks it is. I'm a bigot because of what I believe. Like, I'm not any happier about it than you are. But I have to accept the truth as something that I discover to be the truth. Those are the consequences for that. Now, are there big consequences for this? There are. I referenced that one already. Let me go very quickly and reference then what are sources of truth. One source of truth is intuition. Sometimes intuition is as trustworthy. We can find truth through just our gut. In fact, there's nothing wrong with that being one of the things that holds you to a truth. That you go, I accept that this is true and I believe it's true. I just feel it in my gut. Now listen, this is not sufficient. None of these are sufficient, but it's because of us as the problem. If it's true, it's true, whether we believe it or not. We already talked about that. But one way of accessing truth is intuition. When I've had an atheist ask me, what would cause you to not believe? Like, what would convince you to not believe in God? One, I'm always say, I have no idea. I don't know what would do that. Maybe if I got hit really, really hard in the head. Maybe that would, if I got schizophrenia or some dementia disorder, maybe that would cause me to disbelieve. My belief is just a psychological state. It has no basis, it has no connection to reality. It's real. If it's true, it's true. Whether I believe it or not shouldn't be why you believe it. You should believe it because it's true, not because I believe it or because I don't believe it. Anybody could reach that point. When people fall away, especially big name Christians, what a silly concept, but big name Christians who fall away from the faith, that causes other Christians to doubt. And I'm always like, to doubt what exactly? To doubt other Christians? Yeah, you should have already been doing that. Like, that should be the stance that we all have. You know what? I think you're not a trustworthy source of truth. You'd be right about that, right? I'm human just like you. I'm not a trustworthy source of truth. We need an external source, not just us. So what are some ways of engaging with those external sources? Well, one is intuition. So my friends, when they ask me that, they go, well, what would it take to push you off of that? I'm like, listen, the last one that's going to be really tough for you is to convince me that none of this matters. That at the gut level, none of this matters. That really what I call love is just genetic preference. That what I call friendship is just pack mentality. That what I call morality is just social constructs meant to allow our species to move forward somehow. And you're going to have to convince me that that's a more rational answer. And at the gut level, I'm not willing to accept that nothing matters. Because either it all matters or none of it does. And I'm not willing to accept it. That's one. Another is empirical evidence. How do we learn things? Now, the problem is, of course, we're the ones running the experiments, and we're not super trustworthy. We're the ones having the intuition, and we're not super trustworthy. But certainly, of course, in the church, we should accept and even applaud that scientific empirical study is a good source of learning truth and learning facts. That's totally appropriate. Even though it's humans running the experiments, which means it's got limitations. Another one is history or authority. What we learn from other people who were there, from other people who experienced it. That's important. Before we're done today, we'll talk some more about that. Limitations. Well, it's another human teaching us something about what they claim to have experienced. That's always going to have some limitations. Reason. Reason is certainly very, very important as a source of understanding, thought, debate, and discourse. It's hard for us as modern-day Americans to understand just how important reason used to be as a source of knowledge. There was a day when there's an infamous old story about Francis Bacon that may or may not be true, but in which he was debating with a group of other philosophers, and the debate of the day was, how many teeth does a horse have? That was the debate of the day. So they all sat in a room, and they debated how many teeth a horse had. And at some point, one of the philosophers said, well, I mean, we all came on horses. We could go count. That would be empirical evidence. We could go count. And he was beaten and chased out of the debate group and never allowed back. And you go, well, why would that be? Well, ask yourself, have you ever been wrong? Have we ever studied something or counted something and be wrong? They believed that that human senses were more likely to be fooled than human reason was. Therefore, they didn't trust things like, well, you could count the horse's teeth. Like, yep, and that's not as trustworthy as a reason is. We're not there anymore, right? We're not in an era of reason. We're in an era of empirical evidence. That's important. Then we have, let's talk about reason here for just a second. Any questions so far? Okay. We'll take a break in 10. Is that about right? That sound good? Okay. I'll wrap this thought up and then we'll move on. So how do we know this? Again, I know this is the fundamentals. These are the basics. But so often I'm telling you guys, this is what Christians don't have. I see them when they get involved in a debate or a discussion or a conversation at the political level or even at the religious level or whatever, and these basics are what they don't have, and they end up saying and doing things that are really foolish, and it's because they don't understand where the thinking of the other person is coming from. So that's why we're spending some time here. So I want to help you understand. Let's talk about the concept that Dr. Craig and Dr. Moreland had mentioned earlier that's rejected by postmodernism, which is essentials. Now here's the deal. Everybody actually believes in this. Everybody actually does, or they wouldn't be able to experience reality. They wouldn't be able to engage in reality. Everybody actually believes this. About half of Americans right now would say they don't believe in it, and if you used an example, they would argue with you, and I'm about to show you why that is. But let's start with an essential. What is that? Circle. Everybody answers that, by the way. Everybody says that's a circle, which means you believe in essentials. So, what makes it a circle? And what can I change about it, but still leave it a circle? Does that make sense? So what if I made the circle have colors? Then what would it be? A circle, exactly. Because color is not an essential trait of a circle. What about size? The green one there, what's that? It's a circle. Because size is not an essential trait of circle. It can be any size. Or it can be any color, still be a circle. It can be any location. The one up in that corner and the one over in that corner. Both circles. Because location is not an essential trait of circle. Everybody following me? This is pretty fundamental, doesn't it? That's actually the word. It actually means fundamental. That's right. Now, I'm going to draw a circle with corners. Ready? There we go. There's a circle with corners. What do you think? It's a circle with, I said it was a circle with corners. Is that what it is? Okay, what is it? A square. Now, this is proof of how postmodern you guys aren't willing to be. I said it was a circle with corners. Who are you to say it's not? I'm the one who drew it. I'm the one who labeled it. Look. Even Abraham Lincoln agrees with me that it's a circle with corners. Right? What's the problem with me saying it's a circle with corners? Then there's no such thing as circle. Right? If that means circle means anything, it can mean anything at all. Anything can be a circle because the only trait necessary for a circle is round. It has to be round, and that's what makes it a circle. That's its essential trait. The essential trait of a circle is round. And if I could change its color, I could change its size, I could change its location, all those are fine. But if I change its roundness, I no longer have a circle. Make sense? Everyone actually believes this. Everyone lives as though this is true. Some people try to live in denial of it, and they like, listen, hey, if he says it's a circle with corners, who am I to say he's wrong? But they don't think it's a circle with corners. None of them think that. They all think it's a circle. They're just accepting that I'm allowed to be delusional. I'm allowed to say things that aren't true. That's what they're doing, is giving me the freedom to say things that aren't true. Here's what's wild. Everyone lives as though this is the case, as though some things are true and other things are false. In order to be a human and to live successfully past infancy, you must believe that. Some things are true and some things are false. Everyone actually believes that. So what's good about that is these essentials are still essential even when people say they aren't. We get to still hold to that as Christians, and they're going to need that. Psychologically speaking, and I'm speaking as a psychologist, you can't survive in reality without some of these basic essentials. Now, we may not agree on what they all are. If we said, well, does being a human have certain essentials? Well, of course it does. We could debate for years what they are. Does a God have that? Before we're done, we'll talk about that. What are the essential traits of God? Those are important. Some things are true and some things are not. And it's very important to recognize things that contradict themselves can't be true. So if you ordered sweet and sour, fresh, frozen jumbo shrimp, you just managed to pull 3 oxymorons into the same phrase, right? They can't all be right. It can't be fresh and frozen. It can't be sweet and sour, and it can't be jumbo and shrimp, right? We're creating, literally, we can create silly statements, but if something is false, one of the ways you know it's false is that it contradicts itself. We talked about that. That's important to know. If there's such a thing as false, then we get to talk about what makes something false or what makes something true. So we'll come back to our last source of knowledge, Revelation, here in a second. But let's take that break. What do you mean? What do you mean to? Should I pray? What's the plan?
Yeah, why don't you ask the blessing, and then I'll announce what to do.
Sweet. Okay. Father, we come to you grateful that you are our shield and our refuge. that even as the world is going to seek to batter down your beliefs, your truth, the knowledge that you've given your people through your word, even as the world's going to do that, Lord, understanding why they're going to do that, what the roots are of them wanting to do that is helpful to us. Lord, I pray that you would help us learn to be, therefore, even more compassionate, even more loving, to see that our enemy isn't flesh and blood. The enemy are the powers and the principalities behind the types of lies and false philosophy and false teaching that is running rampant in our world. And Lord, that we could maintain our significant position as your church. And I pray we'll be encouraged by this according to your Son's name. Amen.